Thank you very much, Francesc. Okay, I'll open it up for discussion, comments, questions. Yes, Gustavo.
Thank you so much, Professor Torralba, for your excellent presentation. I just to mention the concept of neoliberalism, not merely with regard to the capitalist or the capitalism regimes, but also with a relationship with China. Do you consider that the concept of neoliberalism is merely related to the Occident countries or Occidental countries, or also include, for example, what is happening in China in terms of experimentation with human beings, the creation of new forms of human beings, as we can saw in last November, and the facial recognition, the Big Brother, and all the liberties that are being menaced by the authoritarian regime.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I really appreciate it. So my question actually is, I completely agree, I think, on the strengths part of your presentation. I'm wondering if you can expand maybe a little more on the constructive agenda or panorama scenario we can contribute to. I'm in concrete, for example, when you were at the end of your presentation talking about Christian categories, right? Which Christian categories might be more useful in your understanding of what is actually going on, right? To be constructive, right? And because sometimes I think that the emphasis that transhumanism is imposing actually on, for example, this idea that everything is possible, and we know in science that this is not true, right? Because there are plenty of reasons, and it's not just because of the indetermination principle, right? It's mainly because although we know the position of all the atoms in the universe, this might be not relevant at all for my life, for your life, for our communities, right? So there are other questions that are relevant for humans behind what is possible from a scientific or technical point of view. So sometimes what is happening with this kind of agendas when they come down to policies or to media, as you correctly mentioned, I think, is that what they sell is mainly expectations more than real possibilities, right? And I think that in this sense we come back to the previous presentations we had in this morning. Yeah, but maybe the question is what kind of categories or principle we adopt or endorse. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that capitalism went through different phases in its history, as you pointed out. And the last big change, I would say, towards neoliberalism was prepared by some people with capitals, with money, putting this money into research institutes, universities, and so on. So it wasn't the case that at the beginning of the 80s of the last century, neoliberalism became so strong. So just looking at this history, if you want to change the current capitalism, which kind of process we should put in place? We shouldn't naive about the fact that only we academicians just write interesting stuff and things happen. So what kind of leverages you see as a possible way to foster this change that you advocated?
I think it would be very valuable to put this in the context of the Church's social teachings from Rerum Novarum onward. And it's very important, I think, that the Church, from the first time that it grappled with the question of the modern economy, supported a market economy, supported private property, supported the trade, supported the functioning of companies. This institution was never anti-market. That's been true from Rerum Novarum. It was certainly true in Centesimus Annus, and it remains true till today. The point is not about markets and even about capitalism per se. It is about the moral framework in which institutions of markets and government operate. Because what Rerum Novarum taught was that private property rights are not inviolable, that the universal destination of goods means that earth and its resources are available for all, that transfers from rich to poor are obligatory under moral law. They are restitution, they are not gifts. They are restoring what is owed to the poor. And so the Church, I think, has a very rich, sound, balanced view, which is important to keep in mind because the issue for us, it seems to me, is the practical issue of what institutional responses, what forms of government, what requirements of law, what modes of distribution should be addressed in a context of private property and market economy. And I think the good news is that there is absolutely a way to identify a moral economy that is market-based, private ownership driven to an important extent, but that insists on economic rights, dignity of all, protection of workers, protection of the environment, and therefore really calls for specific institutional design. And that's how I interpret the Church's social teachings from the start, from 128 years ago in Rerum Novarum. So I think in that context, we should reflect that the way that the market economy works in the United States, for example, is wholly different from the way that it works in Sweden or Denmark. And both are capitalist economies by any definition. They are organized around corporate form. They are market economies. They're open trade, convertible currencies. But they have very, very different underlying operating principles. Most notably is the fact that the Scandinavian countries tax about 50% of the national income and use that 50% to provide universal services. This is the key operating distinction. Everybody has health care, education, family time, vacation time, worker rights, board responsibilities. And so there's a very defined framework that I personally regard as a highly ethical framework and think is very much in line with the basic ideas of the social teachings. In the United States, taxes are 30% of GDP, not 50%. So I regard the United States as the difference of 20 percentage points of GDP, and it's a rather uncivilized country. Nasty. There's no funding for most basic social needs. We have Social Security, overpriced private health care, and almost no social protection, not one day of guaranteed vacation time, not one day of guaranteed family leave time, not one day of sick pay, and so on. That's as close to neoliberalism as we get in the rich countries. It's a disgusting system, by the way, and people are unhappy. But I do think that it's really important to define what we're after, not only philosophically, but then the logic of that in an institutional form. And fortunately, there are places that are fairly decent. They too can be improved, but I would not personally call Denmark or Norway or Sweden an exploitative state. I wouldn't. I would regard it as, for modern society, almost no poverty. No child is facing massive deprivation. I've walked into hospitals off the street of Stockholm needing, an outpatient help on an urgent basis, not even a penny asked for. You walk in, you walk out. So this is, I think, the translation that is really needed. So I agree with you in the logic. I would like to place it in the context of the Church's teachings, which I think you do. And then I would like to place it in the context of a modern market economy, which the Church has been grappling with for more than 100 years, and accepts, by the way. I was advisor to Poland and advisor to Pope John Paul II on Centesimus Annus, and one among many. But he wanted a market economy, no doubt. He wanted Poland to move to a normal European market economy, but within the context of moral principles.
So we have a list of people who want to speak, so we get to everybody. Marcelo first. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your paper and for your reflections. So the triumphalism announced in The End of History by Francis Fukuyama. Too soon to tell the end of history. The triumphalism that announces an ethic of efficiency over the ethic of care and solidarity and admiration that I think you identified and located in the effervescent world of Silicon Valley. It presents a fantastic paradox. It is these megalomaniacal giving us the fool's gold of technology and the digital world as a point of entry into eternal life, eternal and happiness, I guess, is the same tribe, let's call it anthropologically, a tribe of people who today in Silicon Valley are demanding that schools not have computers, not have the children not have screens, not have iPhones, not have the very instruments that form the architecture of this logic of the triumph of technology over everything else. This betrays the problem of fundamental hunger for a life of purpose, a life of meaning, a life of a humane connection between between human beings. So the same people that today we have to ask, so whatever happened with the Washington Consensus and the ethic of the market as in the savage sort of sense of capitalism, not as articulated just now by Jeff, are now selling this new idea, an idea that is extremely self-contradictory. In their practices, these titans of technology are tremendously skeptical of how they're educating their children and how they are insisting on the avoidance of their exposure to these technological instruments that are emancipatory. This is fantastic, and this is empirically verifiable. They don't want their children to have access to these technologies. They're paying schools. I'm a trustee of the Carnegie Foundation, which happens to be in Palo Alto at the Stanford campus. And this is common knowledge.
Thank you. Rocco.
Thank you. It was really very stimulating, and I have difficulties in finding the starting point of what I want to say. But I could try to summarize it. What is good in transhumanism? Because, and also in neoliberalism, every error is a truth taken out of place. If we do not see the truth, we are not likely to convince those who accept that error. I think there are two elements that we should consider. In the 80s, you have this new vogue of neoliberalism as a reaction to the collapse of the Soviet Union and of communism. In Centesimo Annos, Jeffrey quoted it properly, you have this idea. Both had a wrong anthropology. Man is an individual, and therefore he must be free, but he's also a community. He belongs to a community. To be part of a community is not something accidental. It's something pertaining to the essence of man. And you must balance these two elements, creating communities to which man adheres out of his freedom, not through compulsion, but out of freedom. And here I have, I do not completely share the admiration of Jeffrey for the Scandinavian countries. I think that there is one point, the integration of the individual and the community. Should it always happen at the level of the state? We in Italy have a long tradition of thought on the theme of civil society. That is, an integration of the communitarian and the individual dimension of man at levels that stand closer to the individual, because what is good, I think, in neoliberalism is a certain diffidence towards the state, the concentration of power in the hands of the state. Communities, local communities, voluntary communities. Now, through internet, it becomes much easier to create communities that spread throughout the surface of the earth, and policies that not so much draw all the resources to redistribute them, but that favor the integration of demands of human needs and human resources at lower levels. I think there is one point we should not miss. It is important. They think on the basis of two actors, the state and the individual, the market. And yes, there is the market, there is the state, and there is civil society in between. And we have to ask ourselves, how can we revitalize civil society? But the truth is that civil society relies on families and relies on religious convictions. Yes. People who have no common convictions, no common values, will not easily create communities. So I think there's one point we should stress. A second point, a second truth, and that is the truth of transhumanism, is that we have a tremendous new problem. We can integrate artificial organs within the human body in a way that before could not be considered. We have artificial legs that are not just stumps on which, like those of John Silver, the pirate. No, they become really almost a part of the body, and you command them through your own nerves. You can create a connection between the electric impulses of the human nervous system and artificial apparatus that are aggregated to the human body. You can do that with legs, but in the next future, perhaps you can do that also with the brain. So you have really the possibility to expand enormously the capacity of individual beings. And here you have a tremendous social and political and moral, and first of all, moral problem. Who regulates this? Who determines who can do that, and for whom? Because if you leave this to the market, you are very likely in the next future to see humanity splitting into sectors. Those who have the money to buy these new devices arbitrarily, and those who have not the money with two completely different forms of humanity. You may have poor people who need a new leg, artificial leg of the new kind, and cannot have it, and people who make use of those devices for things they don't really need. And the third question is, I appreciated very much what Jeffrey said on Christian social doctrine. If you think it in depth, what is the issue? In a certain sense, we should go back to Karl Marx, not to all of Karl Marx, to one point. We have exchange value and use value. And the neoliberals think that the system is organized on the basis only of exchange value. And exchange value is human desires. Human desires have two defects. The first one is that they are not always realistic. What you desire does not really correspond to the real objective good of your person. The second one is that they depend on the quantity of money you have to spend. If you have no money, you have no freedom. They speak in name of freedom. And I am very sensible to that aspect of neoliberalism. Only if you have no money, you have no freedom. And if there is not a reasonable distribution of income, or at least of opportunities to make an income, then for a large part of the world, this freedom is absolutely abstract. Kant explains the difference between $100 that you have and $100 that are only in your imagination. So for a large part of mankind, that freedom is not a concrete possibility of being expressed. So, and Christian social doctrine said very well the exchange value, because men have needs but also desires, and the way to concretize the needs goes through the desires. But we need the capacity of putting exchange value in the service of use value, of the response to the fundamental human needs.
Two more comments before we turn back. Pier Paolo and then Sister Hella.
I will try to be very, very short and make questions and not interventions. My question is about the cultural roots of transhumanism. Because I do not feel very well with your statement that transhumanism is a product of neoliberalism, for many different reasons. First of all, because liberalism has many different versions, many different streams. You mentioned Adam Smith and David Ricardo, but you didn't mention John Locke, and you didn't mention, for instance, John Rawls as well. For instance, Jeffrey's position is very close to Rawls' liberalism, the egalitarian liberalism of John Rawls, which is so different from what we call neoliberalism, the most radical liberals. But it's not, this is just one thought. there are a lot of other reasons why I do not feel very well with the idea that transhumanism is the son of some form of liberalism. And in fact, it is a techno-gnosis. It's a form of gnosis. And why not? It comes from a religious demand. There is a religious request behind it. Transcending the human is a religious instance, a religious need. Asking, for instance, well, you mentioned the Übermensch, Nietzsche. Nietzsche is not a neoliberal, or Max Weber, rationality is not neoliberal. The Nazi ideology about the experiments of science and technology on the biological human body, these are not forms of liberalism. What happens now in China, for instance, in intervening upon the human body, is not the fruit of what we can call neoliberalism. So I think that the cultural roots of transhumanism are much deeper than what you can call liberalism or whatever it means. So my question is, don't you think that we should look for a more complex explanation of the cultural roots of transhumanism? Thank you.
Thank you. I think a couple of the comments have been prompted here, perhaps Jeffrey, perhaps some of those, by saying the tone of this talk was a bit too apocalyptic. You know, let's give a broader view about this. Or something. And so I would like to say, first of all, that I would say, I would categorize your talk as one of three possible ways that we in this academy, this meeting here, and in the church in general, can face the problems in the world today. And one of these worlds is a kind of prophetic critique. I think you're in the tradition here of the kind of Old Testament prophets. What they say sounds like a Cassandra. It sounds like negative and that. But actually what you're trying to do is wake people up and bring them back to a better relationship with what is good for them, that kind of thing. And you're using quite a powerful technique, which of course some people will react against. It won't always have the effect that you would like, but, and we all know what happened to the Old Testament prophets as well. So I think that's one possible way, but we also have two other ways. We have the way that we saw in Cecile's paper, which we could call an implicit form of engagement. You know, one of the reasons why I brought up Le Bray when I was talking, he doesn't talk about Christian-based economy or Catholic social thought. He talks about human-centered economy, you know, and other people have used that term too. And we don't have to be explicitly Christian. We need to bring out in other people too, through our implicit engagement, which is what most of us are doing most of the time, a truly human-based and ecologically based economy. And then we also have the third model, which is the explicit models, which got challenged today by Enrico in his talk. I'm talking about the Catholic universities, the Catholic schools, the Catholic hospitals, the Catholic, you know, the businesses, some of which say that they have a religious inspiration and all that kind of thing. And we're supposed to actually try to promote a model of education or a model of healthcare or a model of running work systems that are actually coherent with, and we don't necessarily do it very well, and as Enrico's challenge to us brings out. And I think we will have tension between all those models, but we need those three models operating contemporaneously. So I think your model is complementary to some of the things that other people here are doing. That was my first point, and I think we perhaps need to keep that in mind in terms of our work as well. I think then the second thing I would say is, rather than talking about human beings as body and soul, which of course is a very classical way of doing it, it is a certain philosophical idea, which for instance the Hebrews would never have had, you know. I think a much more useful idea in talking about economics and talking about the problems that we're talking about is the one that Maritain proposes when he talks about the individual and the person. Now, the intrinsically relational side of the human person, which is the spiritual side, you know, and which is related to us being in the image and likeness of the Trinity and that kind of thing. So I would say that actually relates to a lot of neuroscience research that's coming out, a lot of genetics research, which is showing that we are really intrinsically relational, that we can't be who we are without the relationships that are around us. But we relate in a way that is at the level of goals, not only at the level of means, which is the way of relating of the individual being. You know, I cooperate with other people because I get something from it, contractual type of transactional model. So I would suggest that it may be better, because, and let's remember that this idea of body and soul is a philosophical theory. You know, it's a very useful theory, but it's not a revealed idea. You know, we don't have to use it, you know. The last thing I would say is, I think this is raising too for us how the church often gives a very unclear voice about what it has to offer. I mean, I think what you're talking about now in your paper are the very, very basic ideas, say, that would have come down to us in the tradition under the heading of natural law. If you say natural law to the average philosopher today in the Catholic Church, you know, they'll put their hands up. They won't accept this at all, you know. And I think this is a real problem that we have in the church. We need plurality, we need argument, we need debate, but we need it on the basis of some common shared, really fundamental values. Otherwise, we're just talking across each other, and we're not able to really carry forward our mission. So a few years ago, the International Theological Commission produced a document, which I wasn't sure how good it was, but anyway, on the natural law today. And I think it would be really interesting to look at natural law from the point of view of the social sciences sometime in the near future. Thank you.
Much. Jeff, very quickly, and then Frances can respond to all these many questions.
Yes, I thought Professor Donati's point was really excellent. All the points were excellent, but maybe I reacted very much to the market part, but the transhuman part is a distinct phenomenon. And the very practical roots that it has right now in Silicon Valley is that the engineers, for the first time, are the gurus of running our society, more than even with Thomas Edison and Henry Ford. They're completely ignorant about all the issues we're talking about. And they are absolutely the nerds who have been doing coding for their life and now have $100 billion to run the world. So it's a very peculiar sociological phenomenon. Silicon Valley is not a normal place. And the people that are running it are coding engineers. And they got rich, incredibly rich. And their technology is very fruitful for a lot of things that make money. And then they're translating that into the transhuman side. So they're coming up with, we'll live forever, I'll put my brain into this supercomputer, and truly bizarre things. But sociologically, this was not the power center, this is not the normal business community. Just to clarify, this is really the engineers, and I know a lot of them. I went to school with them. They're engineers, you know, in the good sense and the bad sense. They really do a lot of good coding, but if you ask them what life should be like in society, don't go there. And so I think you're picking up that phenomenon very strongly and very correctly. And so that part I would absolutely be prophetic about. But what I was reacting to was linking it to the market economy discussion so centrally. And I think what Professor Donati was saying is you have two different phenomena. That one also deserves a discussion, for sure. But it's really two distinct things happening.
Right, very quickly, but we are running out of time, and I want to give Frances a chance to respond.
I want to make one single point. The economic foundations of neoliberalism is neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economics understood from the main question neoclassical economic addresses is the allocation of, which is the best allocation of scarce resources, and it's through market forces. Doesn't allow for state intervention or good policies or regulation, what Jeff was claiming. That's in the framework of neoclassical economics, any government intervention distorts the market. Yeah. So this is very important because yesterday we said that it was Adam Smith. For me, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, they address other questions. They address how wealth is created. Those are the classical economies. The problem is with neoclassical economics. And Jeff yesterday was saying we need to rewrite economics. And this is because as much harm some engineer coders can or may do, neoclassical economics practice not only after Leon Walras, but also after Milton Friedman, has done a lot of harm, particularly in places like Latin America. Because, and in Argentina, we have this volatility also. Part of the macroeconomic volatility, we go from governments that do not think that they don't have to intervene to governments that do not believe in the market and they intervene and they destroy any private sector investment incentive. So you need good regulation. For markets to function, you need good regulation. Capitalist is the most dynamic system we have, but it is a system that is unequal. And in order to reduce inequalities, you need good state intervention.
Okay.
Good policies.
Okay, I'm going to, Francesc, you have a few minutes to respond. I'm sorry that your talk was so fascinating. It provoked this great discussion, but you have 3 minutes to respond to all of this.
It's impossible, as you know. Eh? Well, thank you very much for the remarks, for the comments, and also for the critical point of view. Thank you very much. I'm not an economist. I'm a philosopher. I'm a theologian. There are some questions that I'm not able to answer because I'm not the knowledge to answer. But there are questions that I think that I can say something. I agree that transhumanism is not only a product of neoliberalism. It's true. It's not a product only. No? There are other sources. And when I read the transhumanist philosophers, they explore in the other centuries the foundations. No? Sometimes the Nietzsche's philosophy also. Other question is how can they use the Nietzsche's philosopher in order to construct his philosophy. But it's true, it's not only a product. No? The second, I agree that my point of view about transhumanism is a critical point of view. It's, as you say, a way of prophetic point of view. But for me, it's very difficult to identify a positive aspects of this new ideology, new utopia, or new cultural movement. No? It's really difficult for me to identify these positive aspects. No? The other thing I would like to answer is about the foundations, the anthropological foundations of transhumanism. There is a resistance to accept the finitude, the vulnerability. That's the first sin for me of the transhumanism. They don't accept the finitude, the mortal condition that we are vulnerable beings. We have a physical vulnerability, social vulnerability, psychological and also spiritual vulnerability. No? And the second is also they underline the individual condition, but they don't consider the social dimension of human being that you are right, is inherent to the human condition. We are a thon politikon, as Aristotle has said. No? So You can do a critical point of view of transhumanism if you fixed the exploration in the foundations, but also in the consequences. No? And my point of view is explore the foundations, and in its anthropology, for me, is wrong. This anthropology is wrong. No? And we have to contrast, to opposite the Christian anthropology, because according to my point of view, is a clear description what we are. No? We are spirituality and also materialistic dimension in our being, but we are also individual beings and community beings. No? And the third comment that I want to do is about China. China, for me, is an example that we need a global neo-eco-ethics and techno-ethics. Because if there are some parts in the world where all is possible, or anything goes, it's difficult to limit the utopia to explore anything. No? And there are some experiments with human beings, or the human condition, in this area in the world that is not regulated. For this reason, for me, it's very important an international biolaw and a global techno-ethics and eco-ethics. And we have to construct that with our tradition, our rich tradition, that we have a rich tradition to say something about that. No? Which are the principles, the first or the basic principles? Only fourth for me. Dignity of human being, inherent dignity, integrity, moral and physical integrity of the human being, the vulnerability, and also the respect to the freedom of human being in different senses, in different ways. No? For me, these fourth principles that are inherent in the social doctrine of church are the basis of our principles to answer this new utopia that is called transhumanism. Thank you very much for your comments, your remarks, and your patience.